Have you ever seen a contract that excludes liability for indirect and consequential loss and assumed you're protected? Here's the problem. What you think is an excluded form of loss might not be. We're looking at indirect and consequential loss. Let's look at this important clause in summary now. Direct and indirect losses are different categories of loss. The allocation of a type of loss to the relevant category changes depending on the law that applies to your deal. In business-to-business contracts, it's common for a supplier to exclude their liability for any indirect and consequential losses that a customer may suffer. In other words, there are certain types of loss that a supplier does not want to be liable for under any circumstances, but indirect and consequential loss disclaimers are often misunderstood. Many people think that having a broadly worded disclaimer will protect them against huge claims. But unless the disclaimer expressly lists the types of liability that you want to exclude, then you may end up paying out later. Should you care? In short, yes, especially when you're a supplier. An indirect and consequential loss disclaimer is one of the most important clauses to get right. If you don't, then you may be exposed to considerable risk. Think about it this way. If you have a cap on liability, then without the disclaimer, you could reach that cap quickly. And upon reaching the liability cap, the other party may want to terminate the contract. If you're a customer, then it's often less important to have the disclaimer. This is because there are typically fewer opportunities to cause a supplier such losses. Let's bring this topic to life with a case study. 𝐶𝐸 Limited is a software provider. They license a platform to 𝐈𝐧𝐝𝐿. Due to a coding error, the platform goes down. 𝐈𝐧𝐝𝐿 loses a major deal as a result and claims lost profits. What could go right for 𝐶𝐸 in this situation? 𝐶𝐸 did their homework and knew that 𝐈𝐧𝐝𝐿 planned to use the platform for deal making. They knew that if the platform stopped working, then it could disrupt 𝐈𝐧𝐝𝐿's sales business. This is why 𝐶𝐸 insisted that the indirect and consequential loss disclaimer have an express exclusion of liability for any loss of profits and loss of business that 𝐈𝐧𝐝𝐿 incurs. What could go wrong for 𝐶𝐸 in this situation? Let's say that 𝐶𝐸 has a broadly worded disclaimer for indirect and consequential loss in their template contracts. They never change it when a customer asks, and they don't change it to address deal-specific risks either. The disclaimer doesn't have an express exclusion of liability for 𝐈𝐧𝐝𝐿's loss of business or loss of profits, and it's unclear if such losses are captured by more generic wording in the disclaimer. Given the uncertainty, 𝐶𝐸 wants to settle the claim by making a payment to 𝐈𝐧𝐝𝐿. If 𝐈𝐧𝐝𝐿 wants more than 𝐶𝐸 is willing to pay, then the dispute might go to court, which can be time-intensive, expensive, and stressful for both parties. Now let's look at a sample clause together. Neither party is liable to the other for any loss of profit, loss of use, loss of savings, loss of data, or for any indirect or consequential damages that arise from a breach of contract, tort, including negligence and strict liability, or under any other legal theory. Here's some important points to keep in mind. First, notice that the clause has a generic disclaimer for indirect or consequential damages, and then lists other types of loss, including loss of profit. You can check template contracts in your industry for ideas about types of loss to add to your disclaimer. Consider adding losses that you can't manage, insure or price in. Second, notice the comma after the words loss of data. It has a really important function. The intention is that liability is excluded for the types of loss listed before it, whether they're deemed to be a direct or an indirect form of loss. Be wary that some disclaimers are written to only exclude liability for indirect or consequential forms of loss. So here's the big picture. The indirect and consequential loss disclaimer is one of the most important clauses to get right in a contract, especially for suppliers. Make sure you pay attention to it. Such disclaimers tend to be most effective when you list the types of loss that are relevant to your deal. Don't rely on a one-size-fits-all disclaimer for each and every contract. And remember that it's even more important to get the disclaimer right when you have a high cap on liability or no cap at all. If you find this video helpful, then, for a short time, you can access the entire Build the Foundation in Contracts program for free by signing up for Silver membership at starlitcontracts.com. I look forward to seeing you there.